In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how we can create our project to work without any network connection. You can find the full source code in the description. If you're not familiar with the previous tutorials, this is just a album list application that we're loading up albums and displaying them. But if we load the application for the first time and we didn't have any albums loaded, we are showing an error message that says something went wrong, swipe to refresh. And we're using a library for swiping, so every time we swipe we are trying to get new records and check if we have anything available for us to show. But in our case we have no network connection. So let's see what happens when we actually turn on our network. When we swipe again, we can see that we actually are loading results now. Now let's imagine we just had internet connection and then it disappears again. Let's just turn it off. And if we scroll down, because we have not loaded every image, as we can see, we're missing a lot of stuff here. But the application is working because these are the results that were previously returned from our network request. And also the application is made like that, so if we try to swipe again, it will not work because we're only using the swipe if we are missing any records. So if we have nothing, then only then we can swipe. Let's see what happens if we close the application. As we can see, without any network connection, we're loading everything that was previously loaded. And when we scroll, there is nothing. And now let's see what happens if we actually turn the internet back on. And then we can scroll again, and seamlessly, as we can see, the images are being loaded and everything works as we want it to work. So this is how the application works, and as you can see, it's offline fully, so we don't mind it if the user doesn't have any network connection, or the network connection maybe just comes back at any point. The application should not crash and it should work just fine. So now let's see what's actually happening, in our code. Let's start from here. Actually, one of the modules that we have is Coil module. So this is just, we basically are loading our Coil library, which is image loading library. And as we see, it's very important to have that in our project because we're actually loading a lot of images. And those images, we need them to be cached if we want the user to actually have a full offline experience showing images. We would like those images to be stored somewhere in our device. So that's why just using a library like Coil, it will help us just do it easily. It's nothing special. We're just creating the disk cache and that's it. We're just setting up the settings for the Coil to use its cache. So this here ensures that we have images. Now, the interesting part is probably with our Realm library. We're using Realm to store data on our device. You can also maybe just use Room or whatever the case is. But in our case, because we're loading a lot of records at once, I decided that Realm is just a better solution, and that's why I am just using it. We have a database module for it, which is database module, and we're just initializing Realm. We have our database object as well. And just a couple of queries that I've put here. I'm not going to go over everything that's being involved with Realm and the whole project. You can check the past tutorials again, but we're going to be focusing on exactly the offline part. In the initialization of the view model, we have a couple of methods, which are load albums remote, change albums, list data, and notify albums change. Because we are always interested in the database and what information it has in it, because that's the information that we're going to be displaying, we have this notification on album change, and it's just a use case that I've created, and what it does is just when something is changed, we're just emitting this event, which is refresh album list, and I'll show you later what is doing. If you check the use case, we can just see that we're collecting some data and we're emitting it as well. And this is just because we're separating some of the stuff to have a bit more clean code. But you can skip some of the steps for sure, or just do it however you want. When we check a bit more deep, this is actually the interesting part, and we're using one of the realm class specifics, which is the result change, and result change actually gives us these two, which is like initial results and the dead results. And we're interested in them because, as we said, we want to just watch the database. If something changes, then, we want to know about it. So something can change if the data on initial results, if something is in there, when we load the application, we just want to know, or when we, for example, change something, when we update the database, we want to know as well. We're currently actually returning the results of all the objects in the database, in the results, in the updated and the initial results, but we're actually not using them in the use case just because I've changed it a bit how it works, and I'll show you why. But we're returning if something has changed, which is the important part. So knowing that, let's see what's happening here. Now, as we said, we have this event that we're emitting to the UI, and that's what's happening here. And when we check the event, when we go to our UI and we check where we're receiving this event, we can see that every time we're receiving the refresh album list event, we're actually refreshing our album. The important thing here is to note that we're using refresh because we are actually loading all the records by paginating them, and we're using the paging tree library, and I'm going to create a separate tutorial about it. So just keep in mind that we are doing this because we're using that library, but it does nothing else than just paginating our results as we scroll. But if you don't have, let's say, this paging library in your case, you can always just use the data that we're returning and display that data. So instead of having this refresh list emit here, you're just going to be, updating your view state with the new data. Now let's check our order function. This is just because we want to see, how the getting the information works. We have another use case, which is going to be just returning everything from the network request. And because the API by itself, it's returning records that are not being paginated, we're going to be returning like 100 records at once. That's why actually I chose to use, realm, because inserting multiple records with realm, it's much faster than just with room, for example. So let's check what's happening in this use case. As you can see here, every time, because we're returning all the records and not just part of it, what we want to do here is first we're deleting everything from the database, and then we're actually inserting the new data that has been returned from the request. So that's a very specific thing actually, because usually in API we will have this way of paginating the records, and you might not even need this request by itself, and you'd be just using the paging tree library. But in case you need to do a, something that's bulk getting records on a larger scale, that's how I do it, and I think it's a very good way of doing it. Other than that, there is nothing more specific over here. We're just getting the records and inserting them in the database, as we can see. So this was how we can actually have a full working application on offline mode, and when we just, again, we start our internet connection or just something happens and our internet comes back, the application will be fully working. Just remember, you have a library that will be caching your stuff, because this is making the user experience more pleasant, and also use some database to store the data that you want to actually display. And always, just when you're making offline application, not always, but I find it more easily, just watch for the database changes and work with the database, and don't work with the network connection. Just try to work everything locally first and then continue on. I hope that was helpful, and thank you for watching. If you've liked the tutorial, please leave a like and subscribe for more.